right now to this channel. I have been at the forefront, ladies and gentlemen, of telling you what is going to happen at the Supreme Court. For the past couple of months now, it's really been wonderful. It is the only institution, ladies and gentlemen, that has defended the rule of law. It overturned the Colorado ban 9-0. Even the liberal justices overturned an unconstitutional ban of Trump. I said it would be 9-0. I told you the liberal justices would also side with the conservatives on the Supreme Court to uphold the rule of law. Hit subscribe to this channel right now. You will hear legal scholars talk about presidential immunity. So Trump just got a huge victory overturning the Colorado ban. And hit subscribe and you'll hear legal scholars right now talk about the immunity victory that's going to take place. He needs partial immunity. They'll give him partial immunity. It will go back to lower courts on the federal level, and the special counsel will be dissolved after Trump wins in November. That's how it's going to work. His unconstitutional guilty verdict without a federal statute that he broke, so the New York State Court has no authority to level a federal statute against Trump without the DOJ, IRS, or FEC involved. The FEC dropped the case, as did the DOJ. It's completely unconstitutional. I told you that a 9-0 Supreme Court victory would overturn the Colorado ban. Right now, Bloomberg, Trump's immunity gambit at Supreme Court, a delay is still a victory. They're going to spin it any way possible, ladies and gentlemen. Everyone from Bloomberg to Vox to NBC News is giving Trump a victory on immunity, presidential immunity, which completely dismantles the special counsel cases. The special counsel case against Trump in D.C. will be postponed until after November. The special counsel is a part of the executive branch. Trump can dissolve and will dissolve Biden's special counsel immediately after he becomes president. He's going to win in a landslide anyway. Bloomberg, every other publication is already giving him a presidential victory on immunity. I have been telling you this from day one. Now we're waiting before sentencing on July 14th. July 11th, July 14th is the Republican convention. So we need the Supreme Court to also get involved, and I believe they will, definitely before November 5th, but hopefully before July 11th. Let's go ahead really quickly and talk about presidential immunity and the fact that he's going to get some presidential immunity, which is going to be a huge, huge victory. Bloomberg, everybody else is already talking about this. I have been saying this from day one. Hit subscribe right now. We'll get the official ruling this month, so stay tuned on this channel.
Well, presidents already have immunity from civil lawsuits as long as their actions fall within the outer perimeter of official duties. That was a decision by the High Court 4 decades ago, and it's quite possible, I think, that the justices will extend that civil immunity protection to criminal prosecutions because the exact same reasoning applies. If there was no immunity, the chilling effect on presidential decision makings would trigger paralysis. America would be ruled by a committee of lawyers. So if the Supreme Court does grant, let's call it immunity with conditions, then they'd have to remand Trump's case back to the trial court to decide whether those conditions have been met.
And then Trump dissolves the special counsel, and there goes any chance of Trump being convicted on a federal level. He won't be convicted in Florida, Georgia, or D.C. The conviction in New York will be overturned. He will win the presidency. Game, set, match. That's all she wrote, ladies and gentlemen. And all you know, it's like that song, all I do is win, 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 no matter what. So all Trump does is win, 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 no matter what. Democrats are going to be livid, as always. They're going to be indignant. The indignation will be heard throughout the universe. But that's what happens when you try to continually do things that are unconstitutional.
Another possibility here is the High Court will say, well, there should be some immunity for presidents. We'll give you a little bit of guidance, but we're sending it to the lower court to figure it out. The Supreme Court has done that in numerous cases. But either way, the process will be time-consuming, briefs, court hearings, a further appeal. So it would seem impossible that a trial could take place before the election.
Couple of things, Greg. So they'll hear the arguments, but they're also setting up precedent for the future. And we know that there is some immunity, as you mentioned, but will they get into specific arguments about Donald Trump in particular, January 6th, what he said, documents back to Mar-a-Lago took while he was still president technically? Or will this be a general talk about what is too far? If, for example, a president does an Aaron Burr and shoots Alexander Hamilton, had he not been vice president, that will never, you'll never be immune from that.
Here's the thing. So Democrats, what they've tried to do is they want to criminalize Trump's speech, but he's protected under the Constitution to perform a speech as president. And they're trying to say, well, his speech was an act of obstruction, and he told people to commit crimes. He did nothing of the sort. He's allowed to perform a speech. He's allowed to speak to allies throughout the country in D.C. and other states. He's allowed to contest results. What Democrats have done is they have made absurd leaps of logic, and they said, well, because he was beyond the scope of the presidency, he was acting in a selfish, partisan manner. Everything Biden does is partisan. President Obama as well. Everything they did was from the vantage point of a liberal Democrat in the Oval Office. So how do you differentiate between a partisan, non-presidential act or beyond the scope of presidential authority and something that's good for the country? Well, everything Democrats do, they think is good for the country, even if it's the most partisan, biased thing possible. So they accuse Trump of trying to obstruct and trying to undermine democracy by absurd leaps of logic, stating that, well, even his speech wasn't protected. And so the Supreme Court said, yeah, you know what? He's going to be given some immunity. You can hear Samuel Alito in a second. And if he's given some immunity, the special counsel has to completely rewrite the indictment. So it's going to be pretty hilarious when they find out yet again, just like the Colorado ban, that they engaged in an unconstitutional act to try to get Trump.
That's extreme behavior.
Yeah, I suspect that they will not get into the Trump case because the Supreme Court, when they took this case, framed the question very broadly, whether presidents should enjoy some form of immunity. So, I tend to think they don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of the Trump case itself, even though that's the reason it was brought to the high court.
All right. When you lawyers often talk about the outer perimeter of presidential action, official duties, what is it? Where is the line of the outer perimeter?
Well, it's very subjective. The fact is this arose back, I believe it was 1982. Nixon had already left office, but he'd been sued by a guy by the name of Fitzgerald. And the Supreme Court eventually took the case. And they said, look, there's got to be some protection for presidents. Otherwise, they won't be able to do their job. They'll be defending themselves in a myriad of civil lawsuits over every decision they make that affects any individual. As I say, the same sort of reasoning applies to criminal cases. What I worry about is a president who has to make a very immediate and important national security decision, let's say take out a terror.
By the way, the special counsel in arguments to lower courts and to the Supreme Court actually defended, so Biden's special counsel actually defended the taking of life overseas. If it's against America's enemies, and if we make a mistake, quote unquote, collateral damage, that is okay to Biden's special counsel. What is not okay is Trump's speech that they think influenced people to commit crimes. Trump stated categorically, go peacefully and patriotically. The problem is some people didn't listen to him. And again, there was an entire summer of billions in property damage, and I agree with why people peacefully demonstrated, but there were billions in property damage from people who didn't peacefully demonstrate, and Democrats ignore that completely. And they don't try to tie in the words of Democratic politicians with the carnage and property damage and lives lost. So again, very absurd leaps of logic all the time by Democratic politicians and by these prosecutors. Just like the Supreme Court, the Colorado State Supreme Court being overturned 9-0, you're going to get partial immunity, which every publication out there, even especially the ones that don't like Trump, have already admitted they're going to lose the immunity case, and that's going to be either tomorrow or the next day or sometime this month, which will be a huge, huge victory for Trump. The justices have already ruled on it. They've already decided. You can listen to Samuel Alito and the other justices in a second. They're very skeptical of the special counsel argument, just like they were very skeptical of the Colorado State Supreme Court, and they'll be very skeptical of the guilty verdict in New York that relies on a federal statute that literally does not exist.
Terrorist leader, that could be described as murder. Should a president be charged then with murder when he leaves office over something like that, when he's protecting America's national security interests? I don't think anybody would say so.
Probably
so
the best.
There's got to be some immunity here.
Probably the best example of that, of course, is when President Obama used a drone to take out a 16-year-old American citizen in Yemen. Basically, what we're talking about here is the one branch of the government either limiting or basically eliminating another branch of government.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it eliminating, but defining restrictions about what you can and cannot do in terms of bringing a criminal action. And of course, it's propitious now because there's 4 indictments criminally against Donald Trump, which many critics, myself included, believe were politically motivated to interfere in the upcoming election. It's classic lawfare, the
Greg, it's coincidence.
Of the law.
Everybody knows it's just a coincidence.
Purposes.
Greg, it's just a coincidence. You're such a conspiracy person.
Greg, really quickly, before we let you go, we want to talk about the New York case because the hush money.
So this is the great Alan Dershowitz also stating he's going to get partial immunity. Greg Jarrett, love Greg Jarrett, and Alan Dershowitz saying he'll get partial immunity, which is a complete victory for Trump. Because what the special counsel said is that he's no longer president. The special counsel, Biden's special counsel is trying to imprison Trump by saying he was no longer president when he performed a speech in January. How absurd what an absurd leap of logic. But anyway, the Supreme Court is not going to have it, and it's going to be a huge, yet again, another huge, huge victory for Trump.
The court had an obligation to take that case up, but I know, Greg, yourself, I felt the same way. I wasn't sure that they would. Rightly, they did take that issue up. How do you see the arguments falling in that case?
Well, as you know, I predicted the outcome of this case exactly, how the court would decide 9-0 using the 5th section of the 14th Amendment. On the issue of immunity, I'm going to make a prediction here, too. I think both sides argue too broadly. I think Trump was wrong to have his lawyers say that if a president orders the SEALs to kill his opponent, he can be immunized unless he gets impeached first. That went too far. The answer should have been, of course not. Now let me explain. explain. But I also think the lower court went way too far by having no immunity whatsoever and saying that whatever a president may have had immunity while in office, he loses that once he leaves office. I hope and I suspect that the court granted cert in this case in order to come out with a nuanced decision that focuses on precisely what are presidential acts. And if they're within the scope of presidential acts, then they have to go beyond the presidency itself. Let me give you an example. President Eisenhower in 1954 sends troops down to implement Brown versus Board of Education. One of the children or one of the police officers is killed. And the new president coming in, a Democrat, years later, wants to indict Eisenhower for having done that, even though it was in his presidential authority. I think we would all agree that there has to be some immunity, and we would all agree that he can't have total immunity for everything he did as a politician or as an individual. So I think the Supreme Court, hopefully, will come out with a nuanced decision that will give guidance to the lower courts as to when immunity is applicable, when it's not applicable. We can bring the country together on this issue as well, instead of simply having extreme views on both sides.
I love Professor Dershowitz, but the country will not. The Democrats will view this as an abomination. They will try to rally their rabid, wonderful, morally superior liberal base against the Supreme Court, the only institution defending democracy and the rule of law and defending Trump. If they had their way, the despots and totalitarians and authoritarians within the wonderful, morally superior, highly educated liberal Democratic Party would have banned Trump nationally. Even the liberal justices overturned that. Now they want to remove any protections that Trump had as president, which is completely absurd. He was president and did not tell anyone to commit a crime. He performed a speech, and he had every right to contest results legally, which is what he did. And what they do now is they go after Trump's attorneys and lawyers, saying that they illegally went after, they illegally contested results, when in reality what they did was legal. They went through the courts. That's why it's not like they robbed a bank and it took them 3 years to find out they all robbed banks. They waited 3 years, 4 years, right before November of 24 to say, oh, these lawyers committed all these crimes. Like, well, no, they didn't. The prosecutorial misconduct on the part of Democrats is that they're trying to find legal loopholes and technicalities to censor and punish attorneys and lawyers for Trump who were going through legal channels, okay? While at the same time saying that Trump committed a crime performing a speech and trying to contest results legally. He didn't. He categorically didn't. And so that's why it's going to give, the Supreme Court is going to give Trump at least partial presidential immunity, and the special counsel will have to completely rewrite the indictment, which will ensure that Trump dissolves the special counsel after November when he wins.
You know, I actually concur with what you just said. And I think, Greg, what Professor Dershowitz is saying is that the argument of absolute immunity probably is too broad, and a more nuanced judgment of the court, I think, would probably be more appropriate in this case, and maybe even the better argument for the court. Your take?
Well, I think the Supreme Court looked at the circuit court decision and said, hey, you went way too far. You're dismissing any notion of immunity, even if a president acts consistent with his duties. That is absurd logically. And it's inconsistent, by the way, and this is the important part, with the Supreme Court precedent 4 decades ago that a president does have absolute immunity from civil lawsuits as long as his actions fall within the outer perimeter of his official acts. Well,
Nixon v. Fitzgerald gives the president immunity from civil cases. So how on earth are they going to try to get Trump on criminal cases? And Navy versus Egan gives Supreme Court precedent on a president declassifying or classifying almost anything that he wants, which the Florida case is already not going to happen at all, ever. But he had the power to declassify. Biden and Hillary did not. That's the big difference.
Sean, the exact same reasoning applies to criminal prosecutions. If it's otherwise, my goodness, the chilling effect on presidential decision-making would trigger paralysis. Instead of a chief executive,
So,
America
Greg,
would be
if I might-
ruled by a committee of lawyers. They'd be afraid to do anything out of fear of future prosecution.
Greg, let me ask you this. Would a more nuanced version versus the argument of absolute immunity maybe be, of course, you have freedom of speech, but you can't yell fire in a crowded building? Would that be, would there be an analogy there?
Yes.
And you would
agree
expect
with
the court to
professor.
do that?
And Jordan said this as well. I suspect the current justices will extend the existing immunity standard in civil actions to criminal cases and then remand the Trump case back to the trial court to decide whether Trump's acts are.
They remand the Trump case back to the trial courts. That is an unmitigated disaster for Democrats. The guilty verdict is already going to be overturned. You watch this channel and you'll see that I'm right. The Colorado case was overturned 9-0. The hush money case will be a huge victory for Trump. All he does is win, 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 no matter what. And Democrats are going to extract every ounce of political utility until the guilty verdict and until the hush money cases go Trump's way. And so right now they're obsessing and hyperventilating over Trump in jail. It's like, well, the Supreme Court really does need to get involved before July 11th. But at the end of the day, he's up in swing states. He's up, and you have states like Georgia and Arizona, for example, red states that if he wins and laws have been passed to ensure that democracy remains intact, we'll just leave it at that. So you have, if he wins every safe red state and a couple states like Nevada, which he's up big, he's won the presidency. Now it's just a matter of whether he wins in a landslide with Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, even Minnesota. But let's listen to Will Scharf, his lawyer.
Scharf, he is on the legal team representing former President Trump before the U.S. Supreme Court and a candidate for Missouri Attorney General. Thank you for making time for us today. David Axelrod was a campaign consultant, also worked in the White House for Obama. He now has a big podcast, and he tweeted this yesterday. Based on what we heard today from SCOTUS, it sure feels that Trump may skate past the election without standing trial on the federal January 6 charges.
Even David Axelrod is giving Trump the win on immunity. So ladies and gentlemen, if you watch this channel, I'm ahead of the curve. And I don't want to pat myself on the back. I'm not Nostradamus, but I have been telling you Supreme Court victory with Colorado ban, Supreme Court victory with immunity. I've been telling you for the past week and a half. Supreme Court victory overturning the unconstitutional guilty verdict literally without any federal crime. No federal statute was given in New York. And the Georgia and Florida cases have been already dismantled. So now they just have November 5th. And every day is a countdown to November 5th. Be here on this channel, especially November 5th and beyond. November 5th, I mean, you know how it works. November 5th, 6th, and 7th, maybe even 8th, we'll eventually find out that Trump has won. It's probably going to take 3-4 days. You know how Democrats roll.
If so, the New York City trial is likely the only he'll face pre-November. Under the circumstances, it's the best scenario he could have hoped for. How do you see it?
Yeah, we were certainly optimistic coming out of the Supreme Court yesterday. They seem to be taking this issue of presidential immunity, the scope of presidential immunity, very, very seriously. And they seemed very receptive to our arguments that without a robust presidential immunity for a president's official acts in office, the presidency itself as an institution could be absolutely crippled, and we wouldn't have presidents able to take the sort of decisive action that the Constitution intended because of this fear of political prosecutions after they leave office. So I think it was a great day for us in court yesterday. We'll obviously have to wait a little bit to see their final opinions in this case. But in the meantime, I think we're pretty excited by the way the court seems to be viewing this basket of issues.
So, Will, you know, during the arguments yesterday, there were a number of justices who worried about worst case scenarios. Elena Kagan brought one up where she said, you have a president who staged a coup and asked the military to take part in that. Well, now he's out of office. You can't impeach him. She's saying, is there no way that that would be an...
See, what Democrats do is they accuse Trump. They make really absurd leaps of logic, grandiose leaps of logic. They say, well, his speech was an example of obstruction of a government proceeding. Then they say, well, if his speech isn't an example of an obstruction of government proceeding, well, what if he tries to sell the country to Martians? What then? And so they keep on making these absurd, grandiose leaps of logic to try to justify their completely irrational initial allegations against Trump. So then they say, well, what happens if he does this? And the answer is, yeah, if he does those things, if he tries to eliminate, God forbid, political opponents physically, yeah, of course. But that's different from a speech that Democrats have tried to link to criminal activity that literally had nothing at all to do with the speech.
An act that he could be held liable for. And for the average person who hears that hypothetical on the street, they'd have a real problem with that, even if they agree that presidents need some kind of protection and immunity.
Well, first of all, we think the Constitution provides powerful checks against exactly that sort of parade of horribles, those sorts of outlandish scenarios. And those powerful checks have worked throughout the duration of our republic. We view the far greater threat as being what James Madison referred to as the use by political faction of newfangled and artificial treasons to oppress their political opponents, the sort of political show trials that have been the hallmark of banana republics for so long. Without presidential immunity, that's the future that I think we have to fear. And all of these outlandish scenarios about military coups and assassinations and that sort of thing, we haven't seen that in American history. But this use of the legal system by political faction to persecute their opponents, to me, that's the real fear that we need to avoid. And that seems to be what the Supreme Court was focused on yesterday, particularly with questioning by Justice Alito and Justice Gorsuch.
Will, Shannon asked Jonathan Turley earlier, and it's because she's been getting the question too, and I have no answer to this because I'm not a lawyer. When do you think that you'll get this decision sooner than?
By the way, you don't have to be a lawyer to just, use basic logic. Democrats have made sweeping, grandiose, absurd, completely irrational leaps of logic. Okay, that's why they won't tell anyone what the legal statute is, the federal legal statute Trump broke. That's why it's unconstitutional. A state cannot level a federal statute against an individual, which is why the guilty verdict is completely unconstitutional and it will be reversed on appeal either in New York or the Supreme Court. You don't have to be a legal scholar to know this. You just have to have a basic understanding of the law. I'm not a legal scholar, but I knew that even the liberal justices would overturn the Colorado ban because Colorado indicted and convicted Trump in their own mind, the justices, of fomenting and committing a rebellion. He did nothing of the sort. You don't have to be, Perry Mason or Columbo to realize that Democrats, very smart, intelligent Democrats, are trying desperately to utilize liberal sensibilities to make leaps of logic and then utilize the courts and the legal system to justify their completely irrational leaps of logic. That's all.
Later, or will they wait till June?
I think it's likely we'll see this decision on a normal time frame, which would be, let's say, mid to late June. Remember, back in December, Jack Smith tried to do an end run around the entire appellate process in this case, asked the Supreme Court to expedite things, to have essentially an immediate Supreme Court hearing on these presidential immunity issues before the D.C. Circuit even had the chance to weigh in. And the Supreme Court rejected that effort without a single noted dissent by a 9-0 vote. So I think the Supreme Court understands how serious these issues are. I think they want to take their time getting to the right decision, and I don't think they're going to let a political timeline get in the way of making sure they get the law right here on a momentous issue like presidential immunity.
So you see, even Bloomberg, Trump's immunity gambit at the Supreme Court, a delay is still a victory. So they think, like media Democrats believe it's their right, their God-given right to convict and indict and convict Trump before November 5th. The problem is that, of course, it's not their right. They have no right to do this. And it's pretty obvious that what they're trying to do is utilize the justice system against their direct political rivals with frivolous lawsuits and frivolous criminal indictments, whereas they've actually committed crimes with laptops and private servers and classified data themselves. But let's listen really quickly again to Jonathan Turley.
Be viewed as quite positive for the Trump team. First of all, you had roughly 4 justices referring to sending this back for further deliberations. If they do that, it's hard to imagine the trial judge getting a trial before the election. And if Trump is reelected, you might not have any trial at all. But the argument...
The special counsel, and he could have done this with the Mueller probe. He probably should have. The special counsel is part of the executive branch. So is, by the way, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Department of Justice. So as chief executive or commander-in-chief, as head of the executive branch of government, the president can fire anyone he wants within the executive branch, dissolve the special counsel. He'll do so. I mean, it'll be awesome when he does so. This is not about the rule of law. Everyone on the planet knows that Democrats are trying desperately to tarnish Trump's image yet again. Ain't gonna work. Now they think they have this victory, but it's like this is the same same type of hyperventilating euphoria the Democrats displayed when they cheated Bernie Sanders in 2016. They were so happy. I remember that. I used to be the biggest Bernie Sanders booster on the internet, according to the Huffington Post, before I came to my senses and said, Trump, great economy, amazing foreign policy, the only anti-war candidate. And, oh, by the way, he actually does work to dismantle or at least oppose a very, very corrupt system, whereas Bernie Sanders is literally part of that system. It took me a while to realize, but I did. And so we had record low poverty with Trump, peace deals. He was a great president by every objective measure. The absolute unmitigated meltdown from Democrats and media doesn't mean he wasn't a good president. And more people lost their lives, if you know what, in Biden's first year. But again, literally everything is worse under Biden. But Democrats, their only goal is political power and influence. That's it, not what's good for the country. Let's continue.
Went along the lines of what many of us had predicted. That is, the justices seemed equally uncomfortable with the sweeping arguments of the Trump team and the sweeping decision by the D.C. Circuit. I thought the real haymaker of the argument was delivered by Chief Justice John Roberts, who was openly mocking of the D.C. Circuit, which had this awful standard where they said, well, a president can be prosecuted effectively when he's prosecuted. That is, they had this line that suggested that the fact of prosecution meant that the acts could be prosecuted. And Chief Justice Roberts legitimately said, "But what type of standard is that? I mean, don't we have to have something more?" All of those comments would suggest that there are justices sort of groping in the dark here for a middle road where there might be some immunity for public acts, official acts, but not for private acts.
Really interesting analysis there, Carrie. And I felt like I learned, as we were all listening to this together, a lot from the questioning from Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch. And it was his questions that were followed up by Amy Coney Barrett, Ketanji Brown Jackson. They all referenced back to them. What was your takeaway?
I was struck by I thought, extreme positions of both sides. Yeah. You have Donald Trump, who is arguing absolute immunity for all official from criminal prosecution for all official acts, and then you have the Department of Justice arguing zero immunity. And I thought to myself, well, how can a president function if they have no immunity whatsoever from criminal prosecution for their official acts? And, Brett Kavanaugh who I worked for when he was going through his confirmation process, I thought he raised some very interesting points. He talked about how troubled he was for the trajectory of the American presidency if they were to side with the Department of Justice's approach, which is this, zero immunity, this posture. And, I was also struck by DOJ's argument that, well, don't worry about it because prosecutions are not politically motivated. We take oaths about that kind of stuff. And I thought, how can you possibly say that given what we are all watching happen in New York? And second,
the special counsel lawyer was eviscerated by the justices. Okay, and I've done many live streams on that. The rebuttal from the special counsel to the Supreme Court was, well, Trump was indicted, so therefore the indictment was apolitical, nonpartisan, and only about the rule of law. It could never be about retribution from Biden or Democrats. It could never be about a partisan attempt at hurting Trump because they take an oath to the Constitution. Well, so did Trump, but they're still going after him. So it's like, what? Then the John Roberts and everybody else says, well, why don't we just go and take this to the lower courts, back to the lower courts, remand everything to the lower courts to have them decide what is an official and unofficial act, because a speech has always been an official act. So that alone would completely dismantle the special counsel's case against Trump.
secondly, the person who made that argument was on special counsel Bob Mueller's team, which we all know what that was, a 2-year, $35 million investigation that was driven by politics and failed.
Yeah. So, Leo, the argument really comes down here, too. It seems that the court is considering was trying to challenge the election, a public act or a private act. It's like a president might have immunity from ordering drone strikes against the heads of terrorist organizations. But if the president poisons his entire cabinet because he doesn't like them, that could be considered a private act. So where in that pantheon does challenging the results of an election fall?
Well, I'll tell you, you had the Trump team talking about the challenging of the election as an official act. You also heard him make reference, the Trump attorney talked about President Grant sitting down federal troops to Louisiana. So I think he made that argument. But I want to be very clear. You notice the difference, the quality and the richness of the arguments that you heard on the Supreme Court level? Professor Turley mentioned the reference that John Roberts had about the appellate court. I mean, it was generic. You had very detailed analysis over the last 2 hours. And I'll add you another point. Justice Barrett raised a little nugget about the issue of state prosecution, whether or not the president's immunity goes there. I hope the trial judge in New York heard that. The one critique I would have against the Trump attorney, you never waive a rebuttal argument. And I heard that when he did that, I was shocked. You always have the last word. He abandoned that last word. Shame on him.
Jonathan, what did you think of that?
Yeah, I tweeted at the same time. I was quite surprised. I've never seen a rebuttal waived because there was a lot there still on the table. I thought that the counsel for the special counsel was really struggling at points, and at others he was able to eke out some good solid ground. That's your chance to come in there and to hit hard without any rebuttal coming from the other side. So I was surprised by that. I also have to echo the view that of the counsel for the special counsel, Dreeben, who said, the protection here is basically, we're the government, we're here to help you. I mean, that's basically what his argument was. His argument was, we're the Department of Justice, perish the thought that we would ever go after someone for political purposes. And that led people like Alito and others go, whoa, okay, now you've got a long history of some pretty sordid, horrible stuff. And he wasn't even referring to the Trump years. And sort of counsel sort of backed up a little bit on that. But the point of the justices was still a good one. They said, we don't really like to base the status and stability of the presidency on we're the government, we're here to help you.
So this is Samuel Alito completely dismantling the special counsel case. You're going to get a huge victory for Trump. It'll be marketed in media. It'll be communicated to the average person as, well, Trump didn't get full immunity. It's a real victory on its face, but oh, he got partial immunity, so he actually won. He actually found a way to slither out of the conviction yet again that he deserves. And so, at the end of the day, though, it's a huge, huge victory. Even partial immunity is a huge victory, meaning that the Supreme Court is just going to say, look, he's protected. He can do things like talk to political allies. You can't stop him from talking to political allies. You can't stop him from performing a speech. So you can try to say that his speech was an act of obstruction, but it ain't going to work out. So you need to tell us what is official, what is unofficial, what is partisan, what is for the good of the country, and divide his official and unofficial acts, and then indict him, which will take beyond November, and he'll win November and dissolve the special counsel. But check this out. This is Samuel Alito just completely eviscerated the special counsel.
Dreeben, do you really, the presidents have to make a lot of tough decisions about enforcing the law, and they have to make decisions about questions that are unsettled, and they have to make decisions based on the information that's available. Do you really, did I understand you to say, well, if he makes a mistake, he makes a mistake, he's subject to the criminal laws just like anybody else? You don't think he's in a peculiarly precarious position?
He's in a special position for a number of reasons. One is that he has access to legal advice about everything that he does. He's under a constitutional.
So what? If you didn't like the legal advice Bill Barr gave him, you would have indicted also Bill Barr.
Obligation to, he's supposed to be faithful to the laws of the United States and the Constitution of the United States. And making a mistake is not what lands you in a criminal prosecution.
I don't know if people could hear what I just said. If he was given advice by William Barr, his attorney general, and he needs to pick a better attorney general next time, but if he was given advice and the attorney general said, yeah, go ahead, contest results, go through legal means, just like he did, and Democrats found that to be egregious and they found some way to indict the attorney general also, they would have indicted the president and the attorney general. So what does it matter if he's given legal advice? They're already they're already going after his lawyers. So that argument is, obsolete.
There's been some talk about the statutes that are issued in this case. I think they are fairly described as Malamunsey statutes, engaging in conspiracies to defraud the United States with respect to one of the most important functions, namely the certification of the next president.
Defraud the United States? When have his overall arguments been debunked? There's never a congressional testimony of state and federal officials. State officials and county officials never testified under oath. The only time, so media debunked Trump because we spoke to a county official. And the county official said Trump is wrong, that his lawyers are wrong. Then they said, well, he lost every court case. It's true. You're not going to get evidence within the span of 3 weeks with a rabid media serving as a defense, legal and public relations defense for Democrats. You're not going to get the information, or without an investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation or the Department of Justice, where people are forced to testify under oath like they did with the Mueller probe, like they did with all these criminal trials with Trump. You're not going to find any evidence within 3 weeks that could prove Trump categorically correct. Something that Trump viewed and that many Americans viewed to be very suspicious took place. A man who couldn't even really form sentences together, who slurred his speech and made up words, and he still does to a greater extent now, became the most popular candidate of all time after having lost the first night, and then, in a wonderful, very fair and just, and the epitome of democracy manner, then wins 6 or 7 states where he was losing. And so there are questions, especially when you win Ohio and Florida. And so that night you win Ohio and Florida. And so states that are larger, by the way, than the states that took forever. But anyway, the point is he did not defraud anyone. He was given credible evidence of possible wrongdoing. He wanted to investigate the wrongdoing. Now they're indicting him and trying to convict him for investigating the wrongdoing. And so in the minds of Democrats and those who want to convict Trump on this, he defrauded, he lied. There was no evidence at all. It was 3 weeks, not even 3 weeks. He had nobody testify under oath. He had no formal investigation. And every recount came with glaring questions that were swept aside by media. So anyway, let's continue.
Well, I don't want to dispute the particular application of 371, conspiracy to defraud the United States, to the particular facts here. But would you not agree that that is a peculiarly open-ended statutory prohibition, in that fraud under that provision, unlike under most other fraud provisions, doesn't require any impairment of a property interest?
It's designed to protect the functions of the United States government, and it's difficult to think of a...
Biden became president, Trump left. He's not like, he's not like waiting on the White House lawn for 4 years. The man left. Okay, even with that terrible day in January, there was it happened within an hour or 2 hours or so, the official count. So nothing ever appeases Democrats. Then they were saying he will never leave. He left. Now they're saying he'll never leave again. They just make up these hysterical, absurd leaps of logic and then hyperventilate until they get what they want, and then they just try to convict him for things he didn't do. It's all going to end, ladies and gentlemen, with a Trump victory on November 5th. So just hit subscribe if you're new, and be here tomorrow at around 4 p.m. Eastern.
More critical function than the certification of who won the election.
Yeah, I'm not, as I said, I'm not discussing the particular facts of this case, but it applies to any fraud that interferes seriously with any government operation, right?
So what the government needs to show is an intent to impede, interfere, or defeat a lawful government function by deception, and it has to be done with scienter.
Where was the deception? They're trying to say that Trump didn't believe he lost? I mean, that he didn't believe that he truly lost, so he knew he had lost, but he tried to still keep hold onto the presidency with this deceptive claim of possible misconduct in 6 or 7 states where he was up and then eventually lost. Of course he thinks he won. Most of the Republican Party agrees with Trump. So it's you did not have a Mueller probe investigation. You didn't have an investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation or Department of Justice where county and state officials were under oath. That is the rebuttal to anyone who says it's been investigated, he's been debunked, and he lost court cases.
These are not the kinds of activities that I think any of us would think a president needs to engage in order to fulfill his Article 2 duties. And particularly in a case like this one, I want to pick up on something that the court said earlier about the distinction between a public official acting to achieve public ends and a public official acting to achieve private ends. As applied to this case, the president has no functions with respect to the certification of the winner of the presidential election. It seems likely that the framers designed the Constitution that way because at the time of the founding, presidents had no two-term limit. They could run again and again, and were expected potentially to want to do that. So the potential for self-interest would explain why the states conduct the elections. They send electors to certify who won those elections and to provide votes, and then Congress in a extraordinary joint session certifies the vote. And the president doesn't have an official role in that proceeding. So
Trump did what to obstruct? Of speech? He wasn't even there when criminal activity took place. So it's like, I don't get it. They say that he tried to obstruct and devour democracy. He wasn't there when criminal activity took place. He told people to go peacefully. It's like the man can't do anything without being accused of everything under the sun. And Democrats literally told people, get in people's faces, all these things. And it's like nobody puts two and two together with their words, their rhetoric. Chuck Schumer, for example, went after Brett Kavanaugh, and then right after that, a deranged, wonderful, morally superior, possible liberal Democrat tried to take his life. I'm being facetious with the morally superior, highly educated liberal Democrat part, but once Chuck Schumer went after Kavanaugh with the Dobbs decision, then right after that, a deranged person tried to take his life. Where's the Department of Justice indicting and trying to convict Schumer? It's not happening. Democrats don't live in the same moral spectrum that they utilize to try to convict and imprison Trump.
Difficult for me to understand how there could be a serious constitutional question about saying you can't use fraud to defeat that function. You can't obstruct it through deception. You can't deprive millions of voters of.
Where's the fraud and deception? He didn't deprive anyone of anything. If anything, we've suffered 4 years with Biden. We've already suffered 4 years. What more do you want? How much suffering can you go through? Anyway, hit subscribe to this channel. God bless you all, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you for watching. It's a countdown now. Victory with the Supreme Court. Hit subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow. This will be huge, ladies and gentlemen, and I will be right. There's a victory on the horizon on numerous cases, especially overturning the guilty verdict with the immunity, presidential immunity, and other cases also we can get to. Hit subscribe right now.